Ladies and gentlemen, Psalms 80, verse 15 to 19 says, "And the vineyard which your right hand had planted, and the branch that you make strong for yourself, it is burnt with fire, it is cut down. They perish at the rebuke of your countenance. Let your hand be upon the man of your right hand, upon the Son of Man, whom you made strong for yourself. So will we not go back from you. Quicken us, and we will call upon your name. Turn us again, O Lord of hosts. Cause your face to shine, and we shall be saved." See, being chosen doesn't mean that everything comes to you and you should take that for granted. Each of us is chosen for a purpose. But if we don't accomplish that purpose, what good is it being chosen? It's not to sit down and feel entitled. If you're given a position or gifts, they are to be used with responsibility. And to much that is given, much is required. Let's get into Krypton and how Krypton has comparisons to Man of Steel. In the background, Hans Zimmer's score, which I wish was in Justice League, is playing. The beginning of Krypton starts off with Val L, and he's on trial. And one of the things I noticed is that while I will discuss in another video a spoiler on Krypton and different aspects of it, I just wanted to say that it does look like a television series. It doesn't look like a cinematic movie or film. That's for sure. I just want to make that abundantly clear. And one of the things it looks very similar to, at least in terms of the costuming and uniform, in terms of the L family, is that it looks very similar to the L family that we see in Supergirl, particularly when she was recapping her past, when she was younger. When we look at Val L here, he really does resemble Kara Zor-El's family. Zor-El, which is this guy here, and Kara Zor-El's mother. And you notice that they have the crest. They have the House of L crest in the middle of their uniform. And if you notice here, Val L, who is Superman's great-great-grandfather, also has that crest in the center, and his uniform even looks very similar to the uniform of Zor-El, Kara's father from the CW. So I believe that they're kind of having some sort of consistency with the CW, but they also have some consistency with Man of Steel. A lot of people are saying that, this is separate to Man of Steel, it's different to Man of Steel. And I agree and I disagree in many respects, and I'll show you what I mean. One of the interesting things is that because Val L, he was considered and he was prosecuted as having an act of treason against the guild, the Law Guild of Krypton. The Council of Krypton had been disbanded, and they had given all their powers to the Law Guild, and everyone was under Ra'u, which was the sun god. And because Val L said that he believed that there was other life outside of Krypton, this was considered heresy. And he said that this life was going to come and threaten Krypton, and it was very important that they did something about it. And it's very interesting how Val L actually has a very similar sort of outlook on things. He's a scientist, just like how Jor-El was a scientist, just like how Val L's son, Seg-El's father, was also a scientist. And then you have Seg-El, and Jor-El was a scientist. So he had a whole line of scientists going down the road. So it's interesting that Kal-El kind of breaks that cycle, and he's not a scientist. He's a news reporter on Earth. So I found that very interesting as well. More interesting things to show you guys. So yes, the costuming, Val L had the family crest on his costume. It's called the Guild in Krypton. That's what we learned. That glyph is called the Guild. And Kryptonians have Kryptonian language. If you look here, this is Kryptonian language right here, which is different. I like how they did the Kryptonian language, and then you see it just kind of change into English, which I thought was very interesting as well. But like I said, in Supergirl, we had the father, Zor-El, Kara Zor-El's father, and the mother having the similar type of uniform. And just to make the point, Now the family's crest was stripped, so they didn't have the guild anymore, and they actually were cast to the lowest caste. In fact, they weren't even cast anymore. They were no longer cast. They were no longer a part of the guild. They had no legacy, and they were thrown down to the very lowest level of Krypton, below all of these high-rise buildings. And they were living in Krypton had a very harsh environment, so they had to shield off Kandor in a dome, okay? And so what's interesting is that because they were stripped of their caste, or stripped of their guild, as they call it, because the highest caste used to live in the highest levels of Krypton, and they had the family crest, or guild, as they were called. And the House of L were a guild of scientists. And because of that, they were stripped of that. Seg L's parents, Seg L from Krypton, they didn't have any family guild or crest on them anymore. Okay, and they were both scientists. You can see the mother looks run down, clothing's run down, because they're in the lowest part, they're in the base of Krypton. This is where nobodies are, criminals and that kind of thing. And you see how poor they look here, the table, and look at their stuff that they have. It's very poor. So this was Segal's father, and this is Segal's mother. But you can see, though, that they used to have, and you can see the difference here in clothing, where, you see, it's a similar type of clothing, but just a lot more character to it, and you can see they're impoverished, they're much more poorer. I loved it. I loved it. I loved it. One thing I can tell you, the aesthetics, they really put out some money on this, even though it was still a TV aesthetic, and TV camera angles and stuff like that. But even more interesting is the fact that Val L, when he has to face his fate of being excommunicated and therefore facing his death, being cast out of Kandor, exiled, still ending up in death anyway. But it's interesting, as he faces his fate, look at how he looks. And it's almost identical to the look that Cal had when he had to face General Zod for the first time. And Val L, the commander of General Zod's armies, comes to pick him up. And the Earth armies are behind him. Here you have Val L, Kal-El, and Val L. You know, it's very interesting. And here's the armies behind Val L. Of course, the Zod armies, because Zod is the military guild. And they are there to escort him into the unknown, where he has to face his certain and sudden death. And here, Kal-El is also facing the unknown here. And you can see the posture of Kal-El here is very much similar to his great-great-great-grandfather, Val L. So I thought that was very interesting for you guys to note. Of course, cinematically, it's a whole other level to television. Right, you can see the difference there. And then we have here the Lawmakers Guild. The Lawmakers Guild, or what was known as the Council of Krypton, before it was disbanded, and then I guess it was rebanded a couple years later, because the Lawmakers Guild was disbanded. All of the Council of Krypton gave their powers over to Rao, and therefore there was this one guy with some other people who were basically running Krypton. It was very, very autocratic. And if you look at the Lawmakers Guild, it stands high up, you know, it's way up above the lowest levels of the city. And that's very much what we see here when we look at the Council of Krypton, which is again standing way up above the rest of Krypton. Of course, there's these plates also, and so the building goes through the plates and goes high up into the sky. And this is really great, and you see a world engine there. And this is when General Zod was about to be on trial. Now, what's interesting is that we see that we have a group of people called Black Zero. They're considered terrorists in Krypton because they are freedom fighters who are fighting, but there's a lot of wars between them, and so this Lawmakers Guild has decreed that they are terrorists, which is pretty amazing. And it's very interesting that that's a parallel to Man of Steel, where we see General Zod and his armies. They were also trying to free Krypton from the Council of Krypton, trying to overthrow them. And they were also considered terrorists. So I thought that was a nice parallel again between Man of Steel and Krypton. So there are a lot of parallels here. We see that Seg-El, the boy can fight. Okay, his parents are scientists. They came from scientists. Of course, his father is now working for the Council or the Lawmakers Guild under the guy who's the head guy. But he was a scientist, and Seg-El did not grow up as a scientist. He kind of was fighting on his own, living on his own. By the way, look at this Krypton language here. I really love that. And you see him fighting, and he can fight. And it's interesting, Seg-El is Jor-El's father, and Jor-El, he can fight too. So I thought it was very interesting that, you know, both of them had this spunk fighting. They always stood for what they believed in, that kind of stuff. I thought it was pretty cool. Then we see the Genesis chamber in Krypton. And it's interesting, while it doesn't look as bio imitating as, say, this Genesis chamber, which looks much more like the Matrix and stuff. And again, the concept comes from the Matrix, I guess, where they're harvesting Kryptonians. It's very interesting that they had it anyway. And what was interesting about that is they gave some more details on how these babies end up growing in these Genesis chambers and how it actually happens. You know, we get some information on it, how it happens. And that's very interesting. I won't tell you guys. I won't spoil it. I'll give it in a spoiler review if I have to. And so I find that very interesting that they have the Genesis chamber there. And then, of course, the city of Krypton, I thought very interesting. As like I said, pointed out with the Lawmakers Guild and the Council of Krypton, very tall buildings going up into the sky, you know. So I find that a very intriguing thing that, you know, the buildings are towering up into the sky. You can see the Kryptonian sun there in the distance. And it's the same thing here, Kryptonian sun in the distance. And again, these towering towers of buildings, and at the base of the buildings is where the lowest of the low that are not even ranked or cast are found. And then we see Seg-El there with Azad, who is his lover. And so here's another nice view of Krypton. These tall buildings. Again, there's this kind of matrix thing here where the buildings can actually come up through. And these buildings go. So at the very bottom, we got the bottom dweller people. You know, and it's interesting that we talk about a caste system. It's almost like the world is going in that direction right now. The world where the very, very rich are doing well, and the poor, you know, they're just like nobodies, and nobody really cares about them, and they're mistreated and taken advantage of and stuff like that. It almost seems like we're heading in that direction, you know. But it's interesting. There, the towering buildings here. This is much more space. Of course, the cinematic one looks more bio-organic, which is what I thought was very interesting, and it's much more imaginative. Here, this design more reminds us of Black Panther and stuff, and again, a much more television design. It's integrated. It's much better than, say, for instance, what we have seen in the CW, and maybe even on Netflix, but it's still, you know, it's still low budget, and probably CG, and this is CG, but this is on a whole other level, the design and everything. You can tell cinematic from television very easily. And then we have what in Man of Steel was called the, I forgot what it was called. That's crazy. And it was called a different name on Krypton, but it's just interesting that we still had the same sort of design of, I think it's called a key something, I can't remember what it's called. But I can't remember what it's called. I think it's just called a key. It was just called a key, my something key. It was called something key. I can't remember. General Zod was saying it. Anyways, revoking your authority or whatever. But this is the key here in Man of Steel. Again, a lot more elaborate than the one in Krypton, but I still find it interesting. There are two things that I found very interesting about Krypton. One was that once they came out of Kandor, that was Seg and his mother, you know, it was cold and icy and blizzard-like. And if you just look at the entrance to what was called the Fortress of Solitude, so we don't know where the Fortress of Solitude came from and why Kal-El had a Fortress of Solitude on Earth, and why Jor-El would talk to Kal-El about Fortress of Solitude, because this is where it comes from. And I thought that was very interesting. But here you see that nice circular arch carved into the rock here. Okay, now in Man of Steel it was ice, but it was nice that Kal-El just kind of bored that hole through, and it's, again, just visually very similar. I found that very interesting. So we have all these visual similarities showing you that it's kind of like a prequel to Man of Steel in some ways. Of course, the budget's much more cheaper, and you know, they couldn't do as much as they would like to do. The set designs are not as elaborate as Man of Steel set designs, but still. So you see the opening, he puts the command key. That's what it's called, the command key. That's it. It's called command key in Man of Steel, whereas in Krypton it's called something, sandstone. I think it's called a sandstone, something like that. sandstone. So they have different names for different things. So they call things guilds instead of bloodlines. The Law Guild, Lawmakers Guild, instead of the Council of Krypton, even though they talked about the Council of Krypton disbanding and giving their authority to this guy. Because it's kind of like, what was interesting about the Ra'u thing, which is the god of the sun, which is the Kryptonian sun, is that they kind of consolidated all their gods into one, Ra'u, and they worshipped that. And basically, they ran Krypton under Ra'u now. So it's kind of like the Dark Ages where the world was run by the church. The church and the state were one. This is why the United States of America tries to separate church and state. They don't want them to come together because of what happened in the Dark Ages. They don't call it the Dark Ages anymore. They call it Middle Ages. But it was a dark time because the church, if you said anything that was innovative, like if you talked about, the fact that there may be evolution, or you talked about the fact that there may have been other lives in other worlds, or you said anything that the church did not agree with, you could be called a heretic, and it would be treason, and you would be dead. It's kind of autocratic system, and it's pretty much the same thing. And I'm talking about the Roman Catholic Church, of course, and it's pretty much the same thing that happened on Krypton. So when Val L said there was life on other planets, and we need to be ready in Krypton, they said, "It's heresy." And it's very interesting that General Zod also said heresy to Jor-El when Jor-El was talking about the possibility of his son being free to be whatever he wanted to be. That was heresy for Zod. And it's so funny that parallel is in a different kind of way, but it's still the same kind of way in that confinement seems to be the thing. You can't have any other options. You can't have any other possibilities out there. And so that's why there's this big, in the United States of America, they talk about don't cramp anybody's freedoms. Let people be free to express whatever they want to express, because once it does not hurting other people, because in a society which is oppressive, generally they take away people's freedoms. So we live in a good time in that respect. So here anyway, you see the opening to the Fortress of Solitude. Very interesting. Superman also had a kind of like a Fortress of Solitude. It was a ship, but still same kind of archway opening. And then this opens in a sort of spiral way, whereas with Man of Steel it opens straight like a door. But it's still very interesting, the parallels there, right? And then on top of that, we had this tragedy. I mean, if you know Seg-El's story now, if you've seen Krypton, then you know Seg-El's story. And it was very tragic that, his father died, his grandfather died, his mother died, 3 people died. Of course, 3 people also died in Man of Steel in terms of Kal-El's family. It was Jonathan Kent that died. He also had Jor-El that died, and also Lara Van that died, right? Laura Van that died. So there you go. It was 3 people that died. But here it's interesting, the posture of the mother as the father is dead. Of course, it's more honorable for him to die that way than another way. And it's interesting, you see the parallel in Man of Steel. So there's Seg's mother in the presence of Seg. Seg keeps on seeing his family members die in front of him, man. It's very tragic. But here, his mother here jumping on the prostrated father who's dead. And in Man of Steel, there it is again. And then it's just tragic that, he gave a really painful yell when his father died and then his mother died. And here you see him yelling out there, very much like how Clark was yelling out, "Dad," while his father was taken away by a tornado. Lots of tragedy in the House of L, man. Lots of tragedy. And he looked like he was the last of the House of L. Another parallel with Kal-El, as if he's the last son of Krypton, not just the House of L, but Krypton. So I thought that was very interesting. Now this is very, very interesting. Adam Strange. Adam Strange is a time traveler. I find this so interesting. Here he is holding, of course, the cape of Superman. He's informing Seg-El that he's, the great-grandfather of Kal-El, and his son, his great-grandson, Kal-El, has turned out to be a savior, not just for Earth, but he's also been a unique and helpful person in the universe. And Strange is explaining why Val L's claim of these aliens, another life form, is important, because now Brainiac's coming in to really just annihilate Krypton, and that will erase all the memory of Kal. But what's interesting about this is, when you look at Adam Strange, really, pay attention to Adam Strange. Look at his face carefully. Who does he remind you of? Does he remind you of this guy? Jeff Johns. To me, Adam Strange is like Jeff Johns being in the movie, in the television series. To me, curiosity. What I like about the design in here is this is very similar to the design we saw in Man of Steel. And let me just show you the design there, which I find very interesting. That the Fortress of Solitude has this very similar design, this arch-like design here that you see in Krypton. Again, all of this kind of folding thing, and they tried to keep that kind of folds stuff going in Krypton. It was not as elaborate as this. If you look at this is much cheaper, right? But they tried to keep the folds and the design. And here, when you look at Adam Strange speaking to Val L here, it's very interesting that the design here is somewhat similar to that, right? And these are little passageways you can go through. So I found that very interesting. But Adam Strange definitely looks like Jeff Johns. I mean, it's like Jeff Johns put himself in the movie there. And he even dressed like Jeff Johns. I was like, wow, Jeff Johns, you can find a way to put yourself in the television series. That's kind of cool. So I just thought that was interesting. And of course, the movie ends with with Seg L holding Superman's cape amidst this sign here. And that's beautiful because if you look at this sign, it's very similar to this design here. And it reminds me of the black suit, Superman's black suit. And there, of course, we have a flag here draped, whereas we have the cape here that he's holding. I thought it was just pretty cool. So there are lots of similarities between the pilot episode I found and Man of Steel, just looking through it. Yes, it has a much more television appearance and a much more television appeal to it, but I find it very interesting that in this first pilot episode that we saw, that there are all of these connections to Man of Steel. So I thought I would share with you guys in this video. I hope you enjoyed this video. Leave your comments in the comment section below. On that note, you guys have a great one.